The men who fought below the ground in Vietnam learned to fear the wrong thing first. They thought they should be afraid of the dark or the snakes or the rats. The ones who lasted learned to be afraid of silence. A tunnel you could hear was a tunnel that had not yet decided to kill you. The quiet ones were the ones already moving. Staff Sergeant Bud Calloway understood this before he ever went to Vietnam, because he had learned it 20 years earlier in a coal seam in Harlan County, Kentucky, where a mine prop that is about to fail does not stay silent. It talks. It groans and ticks and sheds a little dust, and a man who knows how to listen has maybe 4 seconds to get clear before the roof comes down. In the autumn of 1966, outside a place called Cu Chi, Bud Calloway put his ear against a wall of red laterite clay and heard the enemy digging toward him from 40 feet away, and he was the only man in his company who knew what that sound meant. This is the story of the man they called the Mole, and the hole in the ground that everyone laughed at, and the 11 men who walked out of it alive. The sergeant's name in this story I have changed, the way I changed them all. The unit, the engineering, and the dates are real, drawn from the after-action files of the 25th Infantry Division Engineers, and from 2 long afternoons I spent in 1983 with a man who had been a tunnel rat with the Wolfhounds, and who still could not sleep with a door closed. If you value stories of the men the history books leave out, the small sergeants and the things they built under fire, take a second to subscribe. There are more of them coming. The Cu Chi tunnels are famous now. There are tour buses. What is not famous is the quieter war the Americans fought against those tunnels, not by crawling into the enemy's galleries, but by digging their own. Cu Chi in late 1966 was not jungle the way people picture it. It was a flat, scrubby district northwest of Saigon, a patchwork of dry rice paddy, rubber plantation rows gone wild, and stands of bamboo that the heat turned the color of old straw. The base camp of the 25th sat right on top of one of the densest tunnel networks the Viet Cong ever dug, though the Americans did not fully understand that yet. They had bulldozed the brush, laid out their tents and their motor pool and their mess halls, and they had done it directly above the galleries of the Cu Chi guerrillas, who came up at night through trapdoors the size of a dinner plate, did their work, and went back down before first light. Bud Calloway arrived there in September, transferred in from a road-building outfit, with 11 years in the Army and a service record that nobody in his new platoon bothered to read. He was 31 years old, which made him old for the work. He had a square, unhurried face, burned brown along the cheekbones, and pale where his helmet sat, and hands that were a map of old scars from a life spent jamming timber into rock. He spoke slow, with the long, flat vowels of the Cumberland Plateau, and the men took the slowness for stupidity until they learned otherwise. Before the Army, Bud Calloway had been a timberman in the deep mines around Lynch, Kentucky. His father had been a timberman before him, and his grandfather had cut props in the same coal company's woods with a crosscut saw. A timberman's whole job is the roof. He sets the posts and the crossbars that hold the mountain up over the heads of the men cutting coal, and he learns, because the alternative is dying, to read the language a loaded timber speaks before it breaks. Bud had buried his father after the black lung took him, slow, over 4 bad years, and he had gone into the Army at 20 to get out of the holes. The Army, with the particular humor it reserves for such things, had eventually put him back in one. His first week at Cu Chi, a trapdoor blew. A demolition team had been clearing a section of captured tunnel near the perimeter, and the charge they set touched off a cache the Viet Cong had left behind, and 2 men came out of that hole on stretchers, and 1 did not come out at all. Bud watched them carry the litters across the laundry pail dust, and he watched the engineer lieutenant, a young man named Pruitt, standing over a sketch of the tunnel section with a grease pencil. And he saw on Pruitt's face the particular blankness of a man who is being asked to fight an enemy he cannot see, cannot map, and cannot reach. That night, Bud did not sleep. He lay on his cot, and he thought about the sound a mine prop makes before it fails. And he thought about how a man might listen for a thing that did not want to be heard. The order that came down to Bud Calloway's platoon in the second week of October was simple. And like most simple orders in that war, it was nearly impossible. A section of the perimeter on the northwest face of the base camp had gone bad. 3 times in 11 days, the guerrillas had come up inside the wire, hit the line, and vanished. Each time the reaction force found a freshly closed trapdoor and nothing else. The colonel wanted it stopped. The standard answer was to find the tunnel and blow it, and they had tried that, and the network simply rerouted around the demolished section the way a river goes around a stone. You could not blow a thing you could not find, and the Ku-chi guerrillas were the best in the world at not being found. The platoon sergeant, a man named Vance Tillman, gathered them in the shade of the command tent and laid out the plan, which was the same plan they had already failed with twice. Dig probe shafts along the perimeter, drop in a man with a flashlight and a pistol, see what he found. Tillman was a hard, clean, competent soldier, the kind the Army turns out by the thousand and could not function without. A man whose boots held a shine even in the Ku-chi dust, and whose uniform looked pressed an hour after he put it on. He had no use for slowness and less for cleverness, and he had taken an instant dislike to the big, slow Kentuckian who had been dumped into his platoon. When Tillman finished, Bud Calloway raised one scarred hand and said, in his slow way, that he did not think probe shafts would work, because the guerrillas would hear the digging and reroute before anybody dropped a man down, and that what they ought to do instead was dig one shaft, quiet, in the right place, and listen. There was a silence. Then Tillman laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has heard a foolish thing and wants everyone to know he has recognized it as foolish. Listen, Tillman said. Listen for what, Calloway? The little men singing down there? He told Bud that this was a war, not a coal mine, and that the Army did not pay sergeants to put their ear to the dirt like a boy listening for a train. He said the regulation called for probe shafts, and they would dig probe shafts, and he picked up the field manual that sat on the ammunition crate beside him, the one with the tan cover, and he slapped it down flat in front of Bud Calloway and told him the answer was in there, and it was not the answer of a man who was afraid to go down a hole and would rather sit up top with his ear in the mud. The mole, somebody said from the back of the group, and it stuck to Bud Calloway in about the time it takes to say it. The mole. By that afternoon, the whole platoon was using it. Bud Calloway did not argue. He had learned long ago that arguing with a man like Tillman only nailed the man harder to his position. He picked up the field manual, looked at the page Tillman had open, which described the regulation probe shaft, 2 feet by 3 feet, dug on a survey grid, and he set it back down on the crate. Then he walked off toward the northwest perimeter alone, in the worst heat of the day, with a folding rule in his hip pocket and an entrenching tool over his shoulder. And he began to walk the bad section of the line slow, stopping every few yards to crouch and lay his hand flat on the ground. The men watched him go, and a couple of them laughed. Tillman watched him too and did not laugh, because there was something in the set of the big man's shoulders that he did not understand and did not like. Bud Calloway crouched in the dust at the foot of the wire with his hand on the warm red clay, and he was not thinking about Tillman or the manual or the name they had hung on him. He was thinking about his father, 40 feet down in a Harlan County coal seam, holding up one cracked finger for quiet, saying, "Lo, listen now, boy, the roof's a-talkin'." And 40 feet under Bud Calloway's boots, though he could not yet hear it, the roof was beginning to talk. The thing pressing on the colonel that October was a number, and the number was 11 days. That was how long it had been since the last clean stretch on the Northwest line, and intelligence at division said it would not stay clean. There was movement in the district. The 25th had a battalion of the 27th Infantry, the Wolfhounds, due to push out into the rubber and the paddy in a sweep at the end of the month, and the whole base camp would be thinned to do it. A thin perimeter over a live tunnel network was an invitation, and the men who wrote the intelligence summaries knew it, and they said so in the flat, careful language such men use, which was that an enemy ground probe against the northwest sector should be considered likely within the period. Bud Calloway did not read the intelligence summaries. He did not need to. He had been at Ku-chi 6 weeks, and he could feel the thing tightening the way you feel weather change in a deep mine, a pressure with no name that the old men called the mountain working. The sector itself was a bad piece of ground to defend. The northwest face of the camp ran along the edge of an old rubber plantation, the trees in their dead straight rows gone ragged and unpruned, and beyond them a belt of bamboo and then the dry paddy. The Viet Cong owned the ground under all of it. The 25th had learned by then, though slowly and at cost, that the tunnel system around Ku-chi was not a few hiding holes, but a city, 3 and 4 levels deep in places, with sleeping chambers and kitchens that vented their smoke 100 yards from the fire, and field hospitals with operating tables and wells that went down to the water table. Tom Mangold and John Pennycate, who wrote the book on those tunnels years later, put the total length in the hundreds of miles, though the figures you read vary, and I am not certain anyone ever counted it true. What is certain is that an American standing on the surface at Cu Chi was almost always standing over a void, and that the men who lived in that void could choose the hour and the place they came up. Lieutenant Pruitt, the young engineer, was the man caught between the colonel's number and the impossible job. He was 24, an ROTC graduate out of an agricultural college in the Midwest, and he had been handed a problem that no school had prepared him for. The standard tools he had were three. He could dig probe shafts and hope. He could pump the tunnels with riot gas or diesel smoke and watch where it leaked out, which mapped a little and warned the enemy a lot. Or he could find an entrance, send a man down with a flashlight and a pistol and a commo wire, and let that man feel his way through the dark, with the enemy possibly waiting at every turn. The men who did that last job, the tunnel rats, were a small and strange brotherhood, mostly little men because a big man did not fit, and the veteran I spoke to in '83 had been one of them, and he told me that the worst part was never the fighting. The worst part, he said, was the moment you put your hand out into the black and did not know if it would touch clay or touch a face. So when the mole, as everyone now called him, came back from the perimeter on the evening of his first day and asked Lieutenant Pruitt for one thing, Pruitt was tired enough and desperate enough to listen. Bud Calloway did not ask for a tunnel rat or a demolition team or a survey grid. He asked for permission to dig one shaft by hand at a spot of his own choosing, slow and quiet, with the spoil carried off in sandbags at night so the work could not be heard or seen. Pruitt asked him what he expected to find. Bud said he did not expect to find anything. He expected to hear something. Pruitt looked at the big, slow sergeant for a while, and then he looked at the grease pencil map of his failures, and he said, "All right." Tillman, when he heard, said nothing in front of the lieutenant. Later, by the mess tent, he told Bud that a man could dig himself a nice, quiet grave that way, and nobody would have to carry him far. Then he laughed and walked off, and that was the second time the name and the laugh came together, and Bud filed it away the way he filed most things, without expression. To understand why Bud Calloway believed he could hear what no instrument in the division could find, you have to go back to Lynch, Kentucky, and to a boy of 9 being taken down into the earth for the first time by a father who did not know how to talk to his son except in the only language he owned, which was the language of holding the roof up. The Calloways had cut timber and set props for the coal company for 3 generations. It was not glamorous work, and it did not pay like cutting coal, but it was the work that kept the coal cutters alive, and Bud's father had a pride in it that he never put into words. He took the boy down on a Saturday when the section was idle, with a carbide lamp and a stick of chalk, and he walked him along the gangway, and he stopped under a length of fresh timber, and he told the boy to be still and listen. There is a thing a loaded timber does. Bud's father called it talking. A green oak prop under the weight of a mountain does not simply hold or simply break. As the load comes on it over hours and days, the wood begins to compress, and the fibers in it start to crush, slow, one at a time, and each one makes a tiny sound, a tick, almost nothing. A man who has spent his life among timbers learns that the rate of those ticks is the prop telling him how much time is left. A slow, occasional tick is a prop settling into its work. A run of ticks that comes faster and faster, with a dry shower of dust falling, is a prop 4 seconds from failure, and the men under it had better be moving already. Bud's father taught him to read that the way another father might teach a boy to read the weather or read a horse. He told him that the mountain always gives warning, every time, that there is no such thing as a roof that falls without speaking first, and that 99 men out of 100 die in mines not because the mountain stayed silent, but because they had stopped listening. The boy never forgot it. He carried it down into other holes for the rest of his life, and 22 years later, in a country his father had never heard of, it would be the only thing standing between 11 men and the dark. His father died of the black lung when Bud was 19. 4 years of it, the breath going out of the man a little at a time, until at the end he could not cross his own front room without resting twice. Bud sat with him at the end. The old man's hands, even then, kept making small movements in the air, fitting a timber, wedging a cap, the muscle memory of 50 years not yet ready to quit. 2 months after the funeral, Bud Calloway walked down to the recruiting office in Harlantown and joined the Army to get away from the holes. And that, Bud would tell you if he told you anything, was the joke of his whole life. He carried 2 things from his father into the service and never lost either one. The first was the folding rule, a worn boxwood carpenter's rule that his father had used to measure timber, and which Bud now used to measure everything: the angle of a cut, the depth of a hole, the thickness of a man's foolishness. The second was the listening. He could not have explained the listening to a board of officers, but he could do it, and at Coochie it was about to matter more than anything in any manual. There was a boy in the platoon Bud took to, the way an older man will sometimes take to a younger one who reminds him of home. His name was Dewey Stamper, a private first class, 19 years old, from a hollow up near Hazard, not 40 miles from where Bud was raised. Stamper had the same flat Cumberland speech and the same way of going quiet when the other men got loud, and he was scared most of the time and trying hard not to show it, which Bud respected, because a man who is not scared in a place like Coochie is a man who has not understood where he is. On the third night of the digging, when the shaft was down about 12 feet, and they were resting in the dark at the bottom of it with the spoil bags waiting to be hauled, Stamper asked Bud, low, what it was he thought he was going to hear down there. And Bud Calloway, who did not talk much, talked to the boy. He told him about his father and the carbide lamp and the green oak prop and the ticking. He took the boy's hand in the dark, the way his own father had once taken his, and he laid it flat against the wall of the shaft, against the cool, red laterite, and he told him to be still and feel for it. Not with his ears first, but with the flat of his hand, because the ground carries the low sounds in the body before the ear catches them. The two of them crouched there in the bottom of a hole on the far side of the world, a man of 31 and a boy of 19 from the same poor hills, with their hands on the clay. And Bud talked low about how the mountain always gives warning, every time, and how the only sin is to stop listening. Stamper said he could not feel anything. Bud said that was all right, that it had taken him years, and that the day the boy felt it without trying was the day he would never feel safe in his bed again, and that this was the price of it. Then they hauled the spoil bags up into the warm dark and went to their cots, and the offensive ticker went on counting down toward the end of the month, when the wolfhounds would move out and the line would go thin, and somewhere under the dead rubber trees, men Bud Calloway would never see were digging too, slow and quiet, toward the same patch of clay from the other side. The first thing Bud Calloway built failed, and it failed for the reason he had warned about in the command tent, which gave him no satisfaction at all. Tillman had not given up on the probe shafts. While Bud dug his one quiet hole, Tillman put a detail to work on 2 regulation probes 40 yards down the line, 2 feet by 3, dug fast and hard the way the manual said, and on the second day of that work, one of the probes broke through into an empty stretch of enemy gallery. There was a brief flush of triumph. A tunnel rat went down, a wiry corporal named Diaz, and he came back up 20 minutes later, white under his tan, and reported that the gallery was freshly abandoned. Cold cookfire ash, a sandal print in the damp floor not an hour old. The guerrillas had heard the regulation digging coming for 2 days, exactly as Bud had said they would, and they had simply pulled back and sealed the section behind them and rerouted. The probe had found a tunnel. It had not found the enemy. It had told the enemy where the Americans were looking. Bud went down into the captured gallery before the engineers blew it, because he wanted to see the enemy's work with his own eyes. And what he saw there changed the shape of everything he did afterward. The Viet Cong tunnel was not the crude burrow he had half expected. It was a craftsman's work. The walls were trimmed clean and given a slight inward batter so they would not slough. The roof was arched, not flat, to carry the load. The galleries did not run straight. They ran in a series of dog legs, each turn sharp, and Bud understood at once that the turns were not for concealment. They were blast traps. A grenade or a satchel charge going off in one straight reach of tunnel would spend its overpressure against the first corner and go no farther, so that a man around the bend might keep his eardrums and his life. The enemy who had dug this had understood pressure the way Bud understood load. He crouched in the dead man's gallery with his carbide habit making him want a lamp he did not have, and he felt something he had not expected to feel for the Viet Cong, which was a professional respect, one builder for another, and on the strength of it, he stopped trying to think like a soldier hunting a tunnel and started trying to think like the man who had dug it. What he needed was not a hole to look down. It was an ear pressed to the right place in the earth, and a way to make the earth speak louder than it wanted to. The answer came to him from the bottom of his own quiet shaft, and it came from water. The shaft Bud had dug went down 14 feet, and at the bottom the laterite turned dark and damp where it neared the water table. And one night, resting at the bottom with his hand on the wet floor, Bud noticed that he could feel the far-off thud of a truck on the camp road, more clearly through the wet clay than through the dry. It was a thing every miner half knows and never says, that water carries the low sounds. Sound travels through water several times faster than through air, and a saturated clay carries a low vibration with far less loss than a dry one. Bud Calloway did not know the numbers, he knew the feel of it, and out of that feel he designed the thing that the after-action report would later call, in its dry way, an acoustic detection sump, and that the men would simply call the mole's ear. He dug a chamber at the bottom of his shaft, off to one side, low, and he let the groundwater seep in and fill it until he had a still black pool, perhaps 3 feet across and 2 feet deep. The pool sat at the level where the damp clay began, keyed into the saturated ground, so that any vibration moving through the water table for dozens of feet in any direction would pass into the pool and set its surface trembling. A man lying on the lip of that chamber with his ear an inch off the water, or better, with the butt of an entrenching tool set in the water and the handle against his cheekbone, could hear through that pool the sounds that the dry earth swallowed. He could hear a pick. He could hear the scrape of a spoil basket dragged on a tunnel floor. He could hear, if he knew the sound, the particular wet chunk of a short-handled mattock biting clay, which is the sound of a man digging toward you and does not want to be heard. Bud lined the chamber walls with green bamboo, split and laid close, the way he might have lined a wet section of mine gangway, partly to keep the walls from sloughing into his pool, and partly because the bamboo, being hollow and rigid, seemed to carry the tremor better, though he would not have claimed to know why. He cut an offset, a dogleg, into the access shaft above the chamber, copying the enemy's own blast trap, so that if the worst happened and a charge came down the shaft, the corner would eat it before it reached the man at the listening pool. He worked at it for 9 nights. 8, or rather, the veteran told me 8 and the date in the report says 9, and I have let the report stand. The spoil went out in sandbags before dawn and got scattered in the motor pool. By day, he slept little. The veteran I interviewed in '83 had seen the after-action report years later and could quote a line of it from memory, a line written by Lieutenant Pruitt and entered into the record of the 25th Division Engineers. And I have no reason to doubt him, though I never saw the page myself. The line was this: the sergeant declined to instrument the detection point, stating that the equipment we had would only tell us a sound was present, while he could tell us what was making it and how far off. I let him proceed. It is a remarkable thing for a regular officer to have written in 1966, an admission that a slow Kentucky timberman's ear was a finer instrument than anything the Army could issue, and Pruitt wrote it plainly and signed his name to it, and that, more than any medal, is the measure of the man Bud Calloway was. The platoon did not see it that way, not yet. They saw the mole going down his hole every night and coming up every morning gray-faced and saying nothing, and they made the jokes men make. Tillman made the worst of them, but Tillman, and this is the thing Bud noticed and the men did not, had stopped laughing as hard. Twice Bud caught the platoon sergeant standing at the lip of the quiet shaft, looking down into the dark with an expression that was not contempt. Once Tillman asked him, short, almost against his will, what a man was supposed to do if he did hear something down there. And Bud told him plain that you would have maybe a few minutes, and that a few minutes was the difference between meeting them in a hole you had shaped for the meeting and meeting them in the open in the dark. Tillman did not answer that. But near the end, when Pruitt walked the line and gave the order everyone had been feeling come, the order that the wolfhounds would move out at first light on the 31st, and the perimeter would be held thin for 3 days. It was Tillman who turned to Bud Calloway, in front of the platoon, and said something that was not quite an apology and not quite a sneer. He said, "All right, Mole, the line's about to go thin as a widow's purse, and the manual's got nothing left to say." He picked up the tan field manual off the crate, the same one, and this time he did not slap it down. He held it a moment, then he set it down soft, and he said, "You better be right about that ear of yours, because if they come, they'll come at the thin spot, and the thin spot is yours." Then he walked off into the red dust, and that night Bud Calloway went down to his pool and set the entrenching tool handle against his cheekbone and listened. And for the first time, faint, far off, slow, from the direction of the dead rubber trees, he heard the clay begin to talk. They came on the second night the line was thin, in the dead black hour before 3 in the morning, and Bud Calloway heard them coming a full 11 minutes before the first sapper reached the wire. He had been down at the pool since midnight. The clay had been talking for 2 nights by then, the slow, far ticking growing day by day nearer and more deliberate, and Bud had marked its progress against the boxwood rule the way his father had marked the working of a roof, and he had told Pruitt that afternoon, flat, that they would come tonight or tomorrow night, and that they would come from the northwest under the dead rubber, not at the wire but through it, from below. Pruitt had believed him enough to quietly thicken the one thin spot and to put a squad on a short string ready, and to tell them to wait for the mole's word and not a second before. So when Bud, at 10 of 3, came up out of his shaft fast and said one word, "Now," the squad was already moving, and the men who had laughed at him for a month were running toward his hole in the dark and not away from it. There were 11 of them in the end who went down into the gallery Bud had shaped. 11 men in a chamber dug for the meeting, and one of the 11 was Vance Tillman. He had come up to the line on his own that night, ostensibly to check the thin spot, and when the word came, he did not go to the regulation cover 30 yards off where the manual would have put him. He went down the mole's hole with the rest, last, ducking his clean head under the bamboo lintel, and he pressed himself against the green bamboo lining of the wall in the dark, with his M16 across his chest, and his eyes shut, and one hand over his ear, and he said not one word the whole time. Beside him was the boy, Dewey Stamper, who had his hand flat against the clay the way Bud had taught him, and who said later that for the first time he could feel it, the low working of the ground, and that he understood in that minute everything Bud had tried to tell him at the bottom of the shaft, and that he wished he did not. Diaz was there, and a machine gun team, and a young medic named Foss, and a rifleman named Okafor, and 3 others whose names are in the report. And Bud Calloway lay at the lip of the listening pool with the entrenching tool in the water and the handle to his cheek, reading the enemy through 3 feet of black water like a man reading a page, calling it soft. 20 feet, they're breaking through. 15, wait. What the Viet Cong did not know was that their own gallery, rerouted after the regulation probe and driven hard for 2 weeks toward the thin spot, was going to break through not into the open camp, but into the side of a chamber an American had shaped for exactly this. They broke through at 3:01 in the morning, and the lead sapper, coming through the fresh hole head first with a satchel charge, came face to face in the carbideless dark with 11 waiting men. And there was a short, terrible, close thing in that chamber that the report covers in 2 lines, and that I will not pretend to render, because the men who were in it could barely render it themselves. The charge the sapper carried did go off, but it went off in the access reach, and the dogleg Bud had cut on the enemy's own principle did what he had built it to do. The blast spent itself against the corner. The overpressure that would have killed every man in a straight tunnel turned the bend, lost its teeth, and blew up the shaft and out into the night. And the men in the chamber felt the slam of it through the clay and through their chests, and their ears rang for a week, and they lived, every one of them. 11 men walked up out of that hole into the gray first light, some of them carried, the medic Foss working on 2 of them the whole way, but 11 men alive. And behind them in the chamber, the thing was finished, and the line had held. What held and what did not is the part the after-action report is good at, because reports are made for that. The Northwest Sector held the ground probe, which division had said was likely, and which would have come up inside a thinned wire at the worst possible hour, came up instead into a shaped killing chamber and failed there. And the Wolfhound sweep went on undisturbed, and the base camp did not lose the line. The mole's ear, the report said, gave 11 minutes of warning where the standard probe shafts had given none, and the gas mapping had given the enemy more warning than it gave us. Of the 11 men in the chamber, all 11 came out. 2 were hurt, one of them badly, the rifleman Okafor, who lost the hearing in his left ear for good and carried a piece of the sapper's satchel frame in his shoulder for the rest of his life, and used to say, at reunions, that he kept it because it was the closest he ever came to being killed by a thing that a hillbilly's bucket of water saw coming. Out in the dark, 40 yards off, at the regulation cover where the manual would have sent them, they found in the morning 2 of the enemy who had come up through a second hole nobody had been listening for, and 1 young soldier of the reaction force who had gone there by the book and met them alone. He was not from Bud's platoon, but he had died at the spot the regulation marked, and the men who came out of the mole's hole alive were not slow to draw the difference, and they did not make the joke about the name anymore. Vance Tillman came back to the hole the next day at noon with the boxwood folding rule in his hand. He had asked Bud for the loan of it, which was itself a thing, and Bud had given it over without a word. Tillman went down into the chamber where the air still smelled of the blast, and he got down on his knees in the wet clay, and he opened the rule, and he measured the angle of the dogleg, and the depth of the listening pool, and the offset of the access reach, and he wrote the numbers in a notebook in his own hand. He did not say anything to Bud about it then. What he did was carry those numbers to Lieutenant Pruitt, and the design went into the next